Welcome to Journey On. Today we have a special guest who has spearheaded the first yoga studio on a military base. She is an International Association of Yoga Therapists. She's written 2 books, Innate Design and Deserts to Garden. She's featured in San Antonio Women and San Antonio Business. She's a holistic life coach, a wellness educator. She's also a 2015 alumni for 40 Under 40. And this woman has push things to the edge where they actually adjusted the age because she was, I think, 21 at the time. And the cutoff was past that. And so she got that, and she's a recovering people pleaser. She advocates for giving herself permission. She's a lifelong student. She's a stress management specialist. She's held trainings for police and military units. She's a spirit who has faith and leans into whatever is called upon her. And when it is called upon her, she takes action. She's worked with Warrior Battalion. She's partnered with Wounded Warrior Project and the USO. And she's opened her yoga studio, Mel Marie Yoga, in San Antonio, Texas. But that's not just it. It's not just in person. She also has her on-demand studio where you can view it anywhere. So please welcome Melissa Aguirre with Mel Marie Yoga. Thank you so much for joining me and just taking time out of your busy schedule to tune in with me today.
Well, it is my honor, and what an intro. All packed in there.
That's all you.
Yes, it's awesome. No, I appreciate you giving me this opportunity to share this work.
Yeah, of course. So first off, everybody's big question is going to be, how you got into yoga and how that all kind of sparked for you.
It's funny because the genuine true story is that in 2009, my best friend was killed in a car accident with another really good friend of mine. And in that very gray window of the in-between of processing and just trying to restructure what life even is, in that aftermath. Being 15 years old, I think, was I 15? I was 15, 14. I was a sophomore in high school. Um, Obviously, in the attempt of trying not to get in trouble, but also be processing and feeling and being in that season. My best friend who had passed away, she has a younger sister who I'm very, very close to this day. She's like the dearest person to me. But she and I were very close, especially after Hayden passed away. And her dad, one day we were like just around the house, and he's like, y'all like stay out of trouble, go do something with yourself. There's a yoga DVD upstairs, go to the playroom, go do something. And we're like, okay. So, or maybe it was a tape, but the first yoga experience I ever had was with this like DVD tape, Rodney Yee, Ashtanga yoga, which I didn't even know what that meant at the time. And we did it. But I remember, during the Shavasana, that relaxation at the end, I was just blown away by how I felt. Being in my adolescence, of course, I was like, whoa, it's like being high kind of. And I love that. Like that was so, I was like, that's crazy how we felt, that you can feel that naturally. And that actually provoked a whole new chapter for basically on and off, but really from my junior year. I ended up getting my own yoga DVDs, and I did yoga every morning before school, like a 20-minute sequence on the DVD every day. But the thing about the beginning for me was I was really using it as a tool to abuse my body. It was really about like discipline and pushing myself to the edge and trying to stay fit or really skinny and like all of that. And it wasn't until I got to college that the integration of the healing and the holistic essence began to surface. And that was due to having a teacher who framed it and gave it a different context. So what I started to realize was how much it was changing my emotional relationship inwardly. And from there, how I became a teacher was at the time my husband was preparing to deploy. I got married at 19, and I didn't know what I was going to do as a military spouse. And I was up in Asheville, North Carolina, as a teacher, with going to these yoga classes. And my teacher showed me an article about how yoga helps with post-traumatic stress for those returning from combat. And when I looked at that article, I said, "This is what I want to do with my life." And here we are, what, 15 years later, 14 years later, and I'm doing it. That's
Yeah,
my
you're doing
story
all
in a
sorts
nutshell.
of stuff. Yeah, you're doing all sorts of stuff with it. I love it. It's fascinating because I think I've even got caught up in that um many times. I mean, I haven't done like yoga in a long time, but especially probably 10 years ago, where I did get caught up in, like you mentioned, is just trying to like do it. And it seems like more of it's kind of like a routine of like a workout routine kind of thing, like, oh, I'm just going to do this, instead more rigid. Whereas when I hear the way that you explain mental wellness and yoga in that combination and bringing the person completely together, there's so much more depth to it. And just like you mentioned, of that you learned that from your teacher, that I don't think a lot of people realize that there is that really deeper meaning into it, unless like you are a teacher and you're doing those trainings and things like that, that I think people get that. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. And I mean, it's
Well,
so
and
good that, go
to,
ahead.
to speak, I want to speak to that because this is a really big thing that, like, bringing awareness is that yoga is like ice cream. There are so many different flavors out there and different styles. And so the style that I was doing in high school was very much structured, performance, progression based. And it's great for specific arenas. But with what I was dealing with, it probably honestly agitated. And this is why understanding the different styles, and if you have an experience you don't enjoy, it's probably because that style or that teacher just wasn't for you. But and then this is why I emphasize, as teachers and as a teacher trainer, our language and context and giving the meaning of why we're doing what we're doing, what it's doing to our nervous system, is so important, so our students can integrate that and befriend their relationship with their practice versus being in the state of just doing and performing.
So it's not just the physical movements and the breath, it also tunes into, I guess the movements like tune into your nervous system, like you mentioned. Um, that's incredible. I didn't realize
Yeah,
that it would impact so much.
so we say it goes through the body to change the mind. And what's so great for people, whether they are recovering from trauma or grieving, is that I don't have to have a conversation with you about thinking better. Rather, by doing these restorative down regulation based practices like exhales, forward folds, the neuromuscular repatterning that we're doing in the movements, it's changing our biology and it's changing the infrastructure of our nervous system so it's easier to regulate. You're activating different faculties in the brain that allow you to process information and see the bigger picture. So I love it because it just happens. That's why people start yoga and they're like, oh, I noticed this changed, right? So it's a byproduct.
That's amazing, because I'm sure you've probably seen with how many people you've taught or trained. I'm sure you must have seen at least one person that has had like, I guess, like a breakthrough moment. Have you ever had that experience, that like on the
All the
mat?
time.
Yeah.
All
Oh
the
my
time.
gosh.
It's like my
That
everyday
gave me
life.
chills. That's amazing.
Yeah, and that's why
Wow.
I do what I do. Yeah, it's huge for, they say like time heals things, right?
Yeah.
Especially going into talking about trauma, grief, and those things. They say time heals, but I actually sit on the table that time can heal, but time also buries. What actually heals things is how we digest sensation and how we learn to reclaim our body in new seasons. And so if you take an experience or tension patterns that we have in these hard seasons of our life, and then you are in these practices that allow us to reconcile the safety in our body again, or just those little snippet moments, but then we can start to digest it into usable energy and it starts to reframe our mind. So it is a process, whether it's on the mat or a lot of the mindfulness work that we do. Yeah, it's a total portal.
Yeah. I love how you explain it. It's so like beautiful how you explained it, cuz I mean I have mentees that I walk alongside in their grief journey through TAPS, and I usually explain it not as great as you do, but I always let them know, like, yeah, like time, you could spend 5 years after like a traumatic event or a loss, and if you're not putting in the work and doing something towards it, then it's just going to be sitting there, or like you said, it's going to get buried. um, and then even so, one thing that I've been working on, I mean, for years, because my loss is from my brother, that died by suicide, that was in the military. And I've had to recheck my nervous system. And so when things come up, I could tell my nervous system is triggered. I'm like, oh, this isn't even something big. This is something so little, like my dog getting out. And then I'm like, but it's just my nervous system is thrown off. So I've even explained that to like my mentees or friends and family, that sometimes it's not just like the event, it's how our body, like you said, how it holds on to it, and how it does, it really holds on to our nervous system. And but you say it's so much more beautiful. If I could just take that little snippet and put it in
Well,
my pocket for later.
if you really break it down, our body does not care about the story. The body is designed to survive. It's a filter for our soul experiences. So the body doesn't really pay attention to the story as much as our sensation and experience with the circumstance. And so this is why attention patterns lodge into the body, is because it's going to do what it needs to do to survive any trauma, any experience. And then that those tension patterns, that reactivity comes out in those little moments. And we can, what's so cool about this work with yoga and mindfulness is that we can address the tension patterns and we can restructure that nervous system. And it brings so much hope and also compassion for us as humans going through these, I call it earth school, but these hard, these lessons and these experiences that can really change our entire identity in a way.
So when like someone's on the mat and say they're working through or just doing the poses, right? Because like if they're doing the poses, um, I think I asked this kind of, but I think a little more detailed is like, do they have those like breakdown moments where they're emotional and because they're kind of releasing that built up tension or built up energy that's in them from, say, an emotional event or traumatic event or anything like that?
So sometimes it happens like that. When I look at breakthroughs, it's new awareness or new insight that informs how we perceive our reality. And what I see happen on the yoga mat for some people, yeah, we might be in a deep hip stretch or there might be a big heart opener and they just feel this emotional surge come up. And what I invite people to do is not worry so much about trying to identify, oh, that emotional response was connected to this, but rather allow the body to move it just to regulate it and not make judgments or over identify it. But we're just moving it out. If this is going to sound kind of silly, but if you think about like our body knows how to go to the bathroom. Like if you got to use the bathroom, you feel it build, 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 and you're like, got to go to the bathroom. And it's the same thing with our emotional hygiene, and we oftentimes get so emotionally constipated because we don't allow the energy of our experiences to move through. Like your body knows how to regulate. Crying, shaking, different sensations are a natural way for the nervous system to come back to coherence. So when we foster environments that allow people to regulate without being in their heads, without being in the attachment of stories and outcomes, but just let the energy move and just go, oh, it's just energy. It's just, emotions is energy in motion. It's just moving through and cool, released it. Now I'm clear, right? And being able to have those processes. So the shapes, the stretches, the breath incorporation, all of that definitely aids that process. It's very adjunct, especially if you are working on something in mental health.
Yeah, and you make a great point about kind of like letting it go instead of holding on to it and everything. Yeah, that's interesting that you again you say it so beautifully. Is um, like, I mean, it's kind of ironic to say beautifully, but yeah, you said, what, like emotionally constipated. I know that doesn't sound very beautiful, but I mean, I usually will be like, oh, some people are like volcanoes, like you just hold it in and then it's like, it's going to erupt at some point. Like you're going to end up stubbing your toe and then there you go lashing out. But it's not that you stubbed your toe, it's everything else that's getting buried inside of you. But that's such a great analogy to explain uh, what is actually happening within us, and that it isn't the story, because we can hold on to the stories so much that we just want to keep jumping on that train or jumping on that merry-go-round where it just is, we're just telling the same story over and over for us to have those same type of environment or same triggers. And it's like sometimes we just need to get off of it and just let it go and walk forward.
Well, and if we look at pain as the doorway into wisdom, right? All wisdom is process pain. And I look at those moments of like our those key points. One thing I love is as a poet, as a writer, we call this in narrative psychology a biographical disruption. So when your story gets disrupted, right? Like the loss of my best friend, this was life, and then there was a whole new life after. It disrupted my story and my identity in that story. And when we are in a co creative relationship to our circumstances, and sometimes it's years later, because for me, it was not at 15 that I figured this out. Okay. It took many years of a process, but then other traumas and other experiences that we naturally collect in life, right? That are all frameworks for us to do that inquiry of how can I make this meaningful? How, instead of leading with my pain story, how can I be in the arrival of the new awareness, this new relationship with life that I can use to help others or to be smarter about things or to appreciate things in a different way? We can use these things as gifts, but when we don't, we bleed on people that didn't cut us. And that's something that I love about these practices is they help us with that regulation and then the ability to be in inquiry with what we're digesting, and our experiences.
And I mean, as we're talking about like grief and stuff, I mean, just based off of the stuff that you've already mentioned, absolutely, it can help people that are grieving or that have lost a loved one. Or, I mean, you've been such a huge impact and advocate about veteran mental health and those that are in service and out of service and their families and all of that. Um, how specifically targeted towards someone that is grieving, um, what would you, I guess, what would you say to them, or what would you recommend? I mean, yeah, absolutely, yoga is beneficial, but how, I guess, can it benefit them? I know we touched on just, having the story and what we tell ourselves and everything, but is there anything else that you can give anyone listening and tuning in?
Yeah, I would suggest, so it's hard to give one. I want to break it into like mind, body, soul. So from the mental standpoint, a lot of these practices are going to, and again, I said it was a byproduct. So for a really brief example, let's say you practice meditation. And it's actually when your mind wanders and then you bring it back that you're building the muscle to be present. So we're training that muscle in meditation. But maybe in your meditation practices and working with thickening the gray matter in your brain and all these things that help with empathy, compassion, and inquiry and that self reflection. With these practices, they can really help us mentally process the story and how we relate to this new story of with grief and our relationship with grief, not being so reactive or judgmental or critical on ourselves through our own process with grief. As far as the body goes, when we do these yoga practices, it helps the nervous system come back to regulation and coherence and doing good things for your nervous system because it is such a somatic experience to have lose someone that you love and it's it's the contract of life in a way. Death is the contract of life, and grief is the contract to love. And so it's a doorway that we're all going to touch base with. And so in our bodies, allowing our bodies to process and feel without over identifying, but just being aware and doing what's good for the nervous system. So yoga is a great tool for that. And then for the soul, I find that these practices really help us befriend our relationship with our loved one in spirit, to reshape our perspective of how what this person meant and how there's when we talk about death phobia in our culture and this fear that we hold around death and loss and not talking about it, it constricts our ability to process something that's very natural.
Mm.
Okay. And when we start to befriend our relationship to see, well, how are they an activator for us on our soul path? And then what can my relationship be with them in spirit? And it can be so powerful and beautiful. And it takes time, but it's also the permission. One thing I find with people grieving, and I feel like grief always, it lives forever. Like, can we just stop the timeline? Like, those things will always, and even with my family members and other loved ones, like you'll carry it with you, right? However, you can be in a relationship with it where you have that weird synchronicity moment and then we judge it and we're like, oh, I'm just making that up in my head. No, like you are allowed to feel like if that cardinal feels like someone you love visiting, it probably is. So stop judging it, right? So yoga and these practices help widen our perspective to be able to be more open to receiving that new relationship and being regulated in our nervous system and also digesting the trauma and the experience into something meaningful that we can help others through.
I love that you said that, like not to judge yourself. That's one thing that I found, just, you know, reading your book and, watching different videos and just chatting with you before. That's one thing that I can take from you that I'm like, everybody needs to know, or like, implement this, is just not to judge yourself. And you see that so much with you. I just wanted to do like a sidetrack on that because that's just huge. And I admire that about you. It's how you don't judge yourself so much.
Well, we're so goofy. Like humans are so goofy. We try to hold this persona and this perfection, and we're so programmed and ingrained to perform and achieve. But the true essence of delighting in the human we are is those sweet, softer moments of us. And I think that our culture, we're a byproduct of the framework our culture holds on what we should do in life, and then we lose that compassion and that lightheartedness that actually is medicine. The laughter is medicine for our soul. And so whether it's my yoga classes or just the philosophy I live by is just being conscious of where am I taking things too serious? Because wherever we get so serious, we get attached. And with attachment like that comes suffering. So yeah.
And we could definitely, I know I've done it many times, throughout my life, is we can get so attached to that suffering that it's like, oh, poor me. And then we could just give us all the reasons as to why we should or could keep suffering. And it's like, sometimes you just have to get off the train. Like, you don't have to suffer. You can move forward. And yeah, it's interesting. And one thing that you've even mentioned before, not on here, but before, is getting curious about your mental and emotional challenges. And that was very, like, I say this in so many different things, if it's therapy or talking with someone, or reading a book, like there's these golden tickets, kind of like Willy Wonka, like there's these golden tickets that are like, you read a whole book and you find this one saying in like a random chapter and you're like, oh my gosh, like this is great. Like that's why I read this book or watched that video or whatnot. Is getting curious about your mental and emotional challenges, like that, with anything, if that's post-traumatic stress, if that's losing a loved one in your grief journey, or whatever the case is that if you can get curious about those challenges and really tune into yourself, then you can kind of, at least this is what I took from it, is like you can overcome it. Now you can get past it if you could actually become kind of like friends with it, like you can understand it because it's also part of yourself. And so um
Spot on. I mean, and that compassion of like, oh, this is why, right? This is what could be like, 'cause we won't know unless we take time to reflect. There's a quote that I love, and it says, until you make the unconscious conscious, life will happen and you'll call it fate. And I think that we lose a lot of our agency and the power of our free will because we think that life just happens to us and we're not in that curiosity. And when we believe that life just happens to us, that victimhood mindset can come online, which it can be protective for sure. Leading with the pain story can oftentimes empower our disempowerment in a way, which allows me to not have to make changes or do anything. And I believe that in seasons of our life, honestly, I think it's okay. Like that's a human thing to do. And then there's seasons that it doesn't serve you. And when that season arrives, being able to, instead of judging things so harshly as bad or good, just being in the curiosity around, well, why do I feel this? What informs, like, where did that story first come from? Is that even my truth? And then we start to negotiate the parameters around our beliefs, because the only thing that blocks our beliefs or limits our beliefs is the parameters we set on them.
hmm. That's amazing because it's like we are the ones that are setting those parameters. Like nobody else is. Nobody else is telling us like, oh, we have to. And um, it's like it seems like we do from a culture standpoint where it's like, oh, these are the parameters. We can't go past that. But um, it's like we can choose to change our own parameters and go past it or kind of do what we want
Well, and if
if
we
we really
believe
want to.
Yeah, if we believe it's always hard, and I don't want to come off as some like toxic positivity like crazy. I'm not, trust me. I'm like there is definitely the curiosity around like always being an inquiry of like what do I really want to feel? And I always default to talking about cozy because I like to be cozy. And that's why it's a big part of the Mel Marie brand and what I do is because I believe cozy is the doorway to nervous system coherence. But if I want to operate my life from a state of consciousness of cozy, for example, hear me out, then I'm going to always be looking for proof of ways to get cozy. But if I'm in a place of it's always hard and I'm in that state of consciousness, I will look for proof of why things are really hard. So this is neuro linguistic programming stuff, right? Like being conscious of what informs my state of perspective or my meality. And when we get curious about that, we can then decide, maybe I can flirt with this and change this a little bit. What do I really want? And I think kids teach us this the best. Like kids are like, there, do you see that in the sky? And you're like, it's just a cloud. But, to them, it can be something meaningful or it's just fun. And that
Yeah.
was once us.
Yeah, like I've used to like gosh, probably like 10 years ago, I used to always say I'm busy. It doesn't matter what the person was, what we were talking about. I would always say, like, if they're like, "What have you been up to?" I'm like, "Oh, just staying busy." Always, even if I wasn't staying busy, but then I would end up finding myself constantly busy. Even if I had nothing going on, nothing planned, something would come up, something I didn't think about, or, a last minute change. Something was always keeping me busy. And then it wasn't until probably about 3.5 years ago when we left and moved from California out here that I slowly started to change the words that I was saying and those beliefs and everything for, the past 10 years. It was like that, it's like that work in progress. It's like the slow chipping away. And then it wasn't until we for sure moved that I was like, I want to start talking about being simple. And oh yeah, life's just simple. And now people make so many comments about that. Like, gosh, you always say life is just so simple, or like, oh, just keeping it simple. I'm like, because I want it to be simple. And even when things do come up, like my pigs getting out on a random Tuesday, hopefully not today because today's Tuesday, but like them getting out, it's like, oh, it's still simple. It's nothing crazy. I'm not crazy busy. It is very simple. And so I keep saying that and believing it because I'm like, that's the type of life that I do want to have. I want to have a very simple, enjoyable life. So I'm going to keep telling people that it's, things are always going to come up in life if we want to or not. And I guess it's the way I want to approach it now, but I like how you mentioned that in a different way.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, when we are aware of even how we talk about things, it does make a difference in our relationship to it. But I always think about kind of going full circle back to the yoga is that for those, if someone's listening to this and they're like, okay, but how do you get your mind there? Because my mind wanders. I really struggle with these different ruminations in my mind. It's going through the body. It's like if I want to, whether it's simple, so let me create the physical environment of simple. When I get ready in the morning, let me just, how can I simplify it? So it's always being in the question of how do I make it simple? Or for me, how do I make it cozy? And then from there, when we're doing these yoga practices, because with the military specifically, or with law enforcement, or any of my clients, everything that I do is informed by the philosophy around nervous system regulation. So I'm not here to necessarily give you a lot of fluffy stuff to say, but rather to get you to feel restoration, to get you to feel a moment, even if it's only 5 breaths of what the exhale gives us or what a release feels like, or to soften, because that's going to train that duality from being so hyper aroused to bringing in some colder water so we're cooling it down, and we're able to sense that, because when we experience that in our body, we create new neural plasticity, neural patterns, that's even possible. So like if you're listening to this and you're like, that sounds crazy, I wish I had a simple life. Well, what if you just for one day, for today, you just played with, how can I simplify? What can I do to make this simple? What if you let your yoga practice be simple today? You just did a child's pose and yet that was good enough. And that's how we start to embody this stuff. We go through the body and then the mind starts to see, and because you're in the embodiment of it.
That's a great way of explaining it, and giving somebody the idea on how they can start that process.
But if you have a desire
Um,
that's laid on your heart, I believe that that desire would not be there if it wasn't meant to be manifested through you. And if we consider that, A, the world needs your medicine, all of us have medicine, and the world needs our medicine. And that when we give permission to bring forward, like if you're seeing a big problem in the world, right? Like, have you ever sat on the back porch talking to someone and they're like, these are the problems? And some of them you care about, some of them you're like, oh, I didn't think about that. Well, when we're in the looking at the world and we see, hey, there needs to be help here, the reason you're seeing it is because you're probably meant to be part of the solution. Like if you have a solution on your heart, it's because you're divinely positioned
mm,
to potentially be part of the answer. And instead of just talking about it, what does it feel like to start to play and trust that you feel called because you're appointed? Like there's an appointedness, a process, a qualification, especially through your experiences, that our experiences qualify us to step forward in things we're passionate about. So it's just being in that trust and that relationship.
and I agree with you. I agree with you, because I mean, even one look where you're at. Like, I like how you talk about like mental hygiene and like all of that, and starting from your friend passing to then becoming a military spouse and understanding the traumas and things that come from that. And even you've mentioned before is sometimes the spouses can be considered a caregiver to the personnel when they get out, or when they're even in and they're having a tough time. And just overall, it's like all of these experiences you've um, walked along the path of this mental hygiene, this mental fitness, sometimes I hear people say. And gosh, look at where you're at here, and I'm so excited to hear all about what the future entails. I know we had like a bit of a snippet of like all that you have accomplished thus far. Um, and I mean, there's two titles I didn't even include that I think are like probably the most important, is that you are a military spouse and you also are a mommy, and those are the most important. um, but with everything else that you have done, what does the future entail? I know we got some stuff that are is bubbling up
Yes.
here very soon, and I want
Well,
to
we
I
are
want to tell
collaborating on
everybody about that and let
candles
you have that
because
floor for you.
we have a podcast coming out this summer
Yes.
called the Veda Lounge Podcast, and it's going to be a place to talk about all Vedic sciences and getting into everything from Ayurveda to yoga to Jyotish to different mindfulness based modalities and how we apply and live it in our lives, and teaching on concepts that are really not super popular. Or, and when I say popular, it's just not known. Like a lot of people in the West or in the yoga industry are very, very somatic based, just in the body, asana based, versus realizing that depending on the season someone's in, sometimes yoga asana or the physical poses are great. But sometimes, I hear people say, oh, I lost my yoga practice. I'm not really in my practice. But if you're playing an inquiry, you are in your yoga practice. If you're doing what needs to be done to feed the children, you're actually in your yoga practice. Like yoga is so much more than just the asana. It's presence with life itself and attending what needs to be attended to in the now. And so we're going to talk about the sciences. We're going to get nerdy, but we have a candle coming out to celebrate and honor this launch because Jyotish, specifically, it's Vedic astrology, which is a different modality of astrology, but what it means is it's the science of light. And when we turn on what was once unconscious to us, what's dark, and we turn on the light, we oftentimes see it's not so scary, or we can understand why, if chaos is erupting in our life, what I always say, don't waste a crisis, right? Because if chaos is erupting, it's an invitation to transmute or to innovate, or like there's some invitation happening when we're being repositioned. And Joy Tish is a phenomenal modality to have self-understanding, to work with cycles and seasons, to pacify different challenges. And so we're using the candle as a signifier of this light, this awareness, which is what yoga is the catalyst to.
I'm so excited for you. That's so amazing. And I mean, you're just such a light for everybody else, and all of the stuff that you have done, and like everything that you have going forward, that it definitely aligns. And what's I haven't even told you, and so I'm just gonna share it with you today, is that, well, one, for everybody tuning in, not only do we have Journey on, but I also have a candle company, Nurture Nature. And so Nurture Nature, that side, has partnered with Melissa, in doing this candle. And what's quite interesting is, for probably about 2 years, um, prior to us getting involved in everything, I was telling, like, my husband, man, I would really want to get involved with like a yoga studio. Like, these candles are just so beautiful, and the benefits of them, like, they have such a light very similar to the sun. And I'm like, it just seems like it aligns with yoga studios. I had no idea how it even come about. I had ideas written down, but I'm like, when am I going to do this? I don't even know how it's going to come about. And then here we are, 2 years later, and I'm like, oh my gosh, it just aligns so beautifully.
When we say, you know what, I want this, and sometimes we just have to let things work on behalf, like things to rearrange, where we just let it happen, let God do what God does, and trust that things are going to come when the timing is right. And I definitely feel the timing is right. I'm so excited about this project. And for fun, what people don't realize is, originally, with the journey and history of yoga, it really started more as a frequency physics based, like our relationship with nature, Ayurveda, which is how elements in nature affect our bodies, and then understanding our soul path and like the cycles and seasons. We just had this big eclipse in Texas that everybody was tripping out about. And I mean, the reality is yeah, we can look up at the sky and say it's so pretty, but there is a clock to it. You know, the sun rises, it's day, and then when it goes to night, we go to the next day. There's a clock. And because everything is frequency based, so we're all subatomic particles. I'm not going to open that window or that can of worms today, because we will be here for the next 3 hours. But essentially, right, what makes us up is it's subatomic particles. We're atoms. And so we're influenced and affected from and I guess maybe instead of saying energy, for those who are like, oh, here we go, hold on before you turn it off, but we are sensitive to our environments. And so part of what influences our environments outside of our homes especially is the weather, right? And internal in our homes we get affected too, because when it's really cloudy out, right, you can kind of feel it. When it's really sunny out, you might feel more energized. So paying attention to weather and how that also is influenced by our universe. And so in yoga, they would use these timings to understand, okay, this is going to be better depending on the individual, because it's very person centric. When is the right time for this? And honestly, it was like higher class systems and monarchies that use this stuff to go like, when should we go to war? When should we declare this? Like, they would use these sciences for identifying the dates and when to do certain things
Mhm.
that's most auspicious. But we also have that internally for our own personal growth and evolution. I'll share with you guys. I don't share this a ton, but part of, like, I thought astrology, for example, was a complete bullshit thing. Like, and honestly, the way it was proposed, like the sun sign stuff, it kind of is, because we are all of the zodiac. You're not just your sun sign. But yeah, like I always thought it was super stupid, and I was like, stay far away from that. And
Yeah.
then I was kind of at a breaking point, because military marriages are not the easiest in a lot of ways, and there's different seasons, and we were in a really tough season. And after our Christian counselor told us we weren't compatible and we should consider separating, going different way. I'm like, oh, it's over. Once the Christian counselor tells you that, you're like, what is going on? But I had a friend who said, you need to go see my mentor. She's a Vedic astrologer. And she's like, I know what you think about astrology, but give it a chance. And I said at that point, I was like, I'll do anything. I'm open
Oh,
to anything. And I mean, it was transformative for our relationship and understanding each other. But what was the yes for me? Because I got on the phone with her before. She ended up pulling up my chart right when we were on the phone, and she said, "Ooh, what happened?" Or something big happened in 2009. I'd never talked to this woman in my life, and that was when I lost my best friend. And she said, "Ooh, things got really hard in 2009, and you kind of felt it, and it's been pretty tough,
oh,
huh?"
wow.
I said, "Oh my gosh, no one, yes, you know." And but now I understand it's because there's a science to it. But that was what started my journey with Jyotish and Vedic astrology. Was literally her saying that on the phone, and I was like, "All right, schedule me."
There is so many different areas of it. I mean, just a few that you've mentioned, I mean, I don't have any knowledge of that, all of those different modalities. I have had previously had my chart done and then I lost it. So I never got to read it. And I think I read maybe the first 2 pages, but I'm like, I mean, I was young. I think it was like 15 or 16 when I got it. And so it was like, oh, well, what all this other stuff isn't going to mean anything. But it was fascinating, just the little bits that was already in there. I mean, I agree with you. Like there is that greater knowledge out there, and it all is one with each other. Like it all works together. It all is a part of it. Like you do look at just like, oh, what's your astrology today? And it's like, well, that can apply to everybody. And I mean, I agree with you as well that yeah, we kind of have a little bit of all of it.
There is different energy in different areas of your life where for one it's going to be different than the other. But it got watered down in the 1980s when everybody was able to access charts, because you got to remember that in order to cast a chart, for whether it was in Europe, Egypt, India, anywhere in China, like there's all these different systems, because it was something that was only for, very wealthy, higher caste governments and things of that nature. And then you had to be a mathematician to understand the astronomy, the degrees, like all of the stuff that goes into casting a chart. When the calculator stuff came out, that's when I think I kind of joke. I'm like, whoever is doing this stuff at the top, they probably came out and they were like, oh, no, 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 we can't let the normal people have this. So make it weird. Sun sign astrology. The greatest thing any of us can do is just like be loving and kind to one another and have empathy and be patient and be present for the kids and bring joy. And like every room you go into, that you truly are like, when I leave, this room was left a better place. And being in that consciousness of love and compassion. But it's very hard to give it out there if we don't spare it for ourselves. And it's harder to have empathy and compassion with others if we don't believe that people will have grace with us and have compassion for ourselves. So there's a mirror that both matter, both absolutely matter. You can't pour from an empty cup.
Yeah, and when you do work like on that on yourself, it's like that empowering, and then it's like you can use that power to go do good for other people, or leave it better
What's the
than it
value
was
without
before
giving it
you
away,
showed
huh?
up. That's beautiful. You are such a light. I said you are just such a light, and I'm so excited for the Veda Lounge, and I'm so excited to tune in and everything that's gonna evolve with it and through it, and everybody that you're gonna impact. Even more so than you've already come to this point. I'm very, very, very excited for you and all of it, and tuning in and all that. Is there anything else that you wanted to share about it? If you have anything else to share about the Veda Lounge?
Think it's going to be on Spotify and YouTube. But one thing to say is that mindfulness, yoga, all this stuff, I mean, if you fish, you're practicing mindfulness. I actually teach mindful marksmanship and bringing mindfulness and mindset tools for qualifications and precision with firearms. Like there's so many arenas that this stuff can serve. And it's really just our state of beingness. And all you need is to meet yourself as you are. You get to make it yours and you get to have your own experience. So my hope and prayer is for everybody to give themselves permission to be in their process, and that we're all just walking each other home. So
Can you elaborate a little bit on that before we close this out with you? Is because you're saying that you can bring the yoga to like anything that you're doing, like fishing,
yes and no.
like the
So
being the
obviously,
presence, like you've mentioned.
presence is a mindfulness for what is meaningful right now. So like I'm attending right here because this is meaningful right now. But when we look at to amplify the experience so it's more meditative, if you're paying attention with your breath, you're softening your body, right? If I'm fishing and I'm sensing with my hands, you're building that interoception. Honestly, it can be like a yoga practice, literally, because if you're paying attention and you're using your breath and you're sensing and then being present with when it's time to begin to reel in or when to recast. Same with firearms, being aware of my body. Am I soft? Being in the stance that feels most stable, to having a vision. You can visualize where you're going to be sending. And I mean, the way you hold your breath, the cadence, like all of that stuff, even setting intention, right? And I always believe too, any type of precision or accuracy, if we're looking for that, if you train your nervous system beforehand, it's a lot easier to perform in those moments. And I have a lot to say on like just with how we bring things into our body and being in our bodies. Self literacy is so important when we're doing physical tasks. But the point of anything action, if you're pouring your coffee, and even just saying like bless your coffee, may this like bless me and inspire and infuse me with energy today, may this like thank you, or being in a gratitude. I always say gratitude is really just being aware of what you love. Like, I love my coffee. Oh, I'm so thankful for my coffee, or I'm so thankful for this person, right? I love this thing, I love this thing. Again, it's being in these relationships and attending all the textures of the present moment, and also getting to decide if this doesn't serve me, that I have agency and I can redirect it. If I'm done fishing or my back's hurting, well, stand up, do something, adapt it, negotiate it for your back. Now sit back down, keep fishing. Or maybe you go stand. It's being in that conversation and the dialogue in our own bodies and in our own experiences on and off the mat. So, yeah, this stuff stretches everywhere, it really does.
It kind of reminds me of like there's some people like the only thing that can come to mind is like when someone like skateboards and you're like the skateboard is just like attached to them. Like there's no way that they're like two separate things. It's like they are just so connected and it just goes perfect or smoothly or whatnot. I don't know. That's what it reminded me of. They're so present in it and it's just like they're just like this connection between them or just I think anything sports. I mean just thinking of all the different things that people can do from hiking. I mean, those are like the typical stuff, I guess, that some people will do would be like, oh, hiking and these slow, calm things. But I do find it very interesting. And I'm glad that you mentioned that for everybody else, as well as myself, that you can bring this, or like we do it and we don't even realize that we're doing it, that we're already implementing it. And maybe we could just fine tune it in some ways where, some of us are rushing out the door or I just needed this cup of coffee and I just need to go. And it's like, no, you can slow down, take a breath, come back to figure out what you need. Because I think a lot of us really do leave ourselves. I know I have been there many, many times when I was working outside of the home and commuting. It was like, I just needed to do the tasks. And it was so hard to tune back into like me and who I am and what I'm doing, like in the present. I was always like thinking ahead.
And that pressure creates a sense of
Mm-hmm.
urgency. So, what we want to change is our relationship to the pressure. And that's, again, this is what we're doing in yoga, is we're creating space between our beliefs and our reactions, or the sensations and our reactions. So I can start to decide, okay, I'm feeling pressure. And then the next question is it self-induced, or is someone really waiting on me right now? 80% of the time it's self-induced. Okay. And so yeah, it's like when we start to reflect on wait, and then we can start to
Yeah.
renegotiate, and that's how we change that neuroplasticity, and then releasing that pressure that creates all this urgency. I live by the belief like what if you just lived and believed it already happened? All the good things have happened. We're just here in the timeline, and you can trust it. So just keep showing up. It's going to happen. It's going to unfold, and we're always positioned for our highest good. And just being in that inquiry, right? What does that feel like? I mean, it's powerful stuff. It's little stuff. It kind of sounds silly when I say this stuff out loud, but
Yeah.
when personally applied, I mean, I've seen so many beautiful things happen for people, and I've seen it in my own life too. So that's why I talk about it. It's weird.
Yeah. And I think that's part of it. I think we overcomplicate everything. It's like, well, it doesn't need to be that complicated. It is these very simple things that it's like we want to make it complicated as if that's going to make it more important. And it's like, no, it's very simple. It's these tiny little things that you can do to have these long lasting or huge changes. And so I just had one last question, because I just want to gain some of your wisdom and to share with everybody else, is when you say that space between your pressure, when we were talking about pressure, is like the pressure between that and your reaction, is that like the space, is that like the time, or is that the, oh, you kind of talking yourself down and being like, oh, hey, this
It's
isn't
both.
that bad.
When we create space, we go, oh, I'm feeling this pressure. Is this mine? What's going on? And we kind of have a moment before we go into that reaction or that response. So yeah, it like helps us slow down the chaos so we can see clearly. And then we can make choices deliberately from there versus unconsciously operating under urgency all the time. Then we miss out when we're like that, right? Like our kids don't feel seen, and they're like, there's just so much that falls in the cracks, and it's not as effective as, hold on, what do we need to do? Like I doing moments to ground, as we start the day, what needs to be done, right? What are my things, and then being intentional versus just like getting things done. There's a state of being that we can kind of shift just by being curious about it.
I like that, the curiosity. I love it.
Well, it just depends, right? And listening to your body. And then when we're at those moments, when you create space like that and you're
Yeah.
getting curious, then you can innovate.
I'm very excited about, again, about the Veda Lounge and you and your co-host and all of that and everything that's coming up. And you're not slowing down anytime soon. So I'm so glad that we were able to share this space, and you have so much wisdom and you advocate for mental hygiene. And I think more people just it needs to be shouted from the rooftops. So many people from all walks of life can benefit from your wisdom, and I hope you light up more pathways for other people that normally don't come across your pathway. If it's from this podcast and your books, I think you're just such a light that is just shining on so many people, and it's beautiful. I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy
Thank you so
schedule
much.
and tuning in with me today.